There's a specific moment, quiet and internal, when something in you finally shifts from hoping to done, from bargaining to clear, from asking what you could do differently to simply knowing you can't keep doing this anymore. This moment doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It usually arrives after a long accumulation of smaller moments, each one adding a little more weight until the scale finally, undeniably tips. This is your breaking point, and it belongs entirely to you, built out of your own experience, your own limits, your own accumulated evidence that something has to change. The question of what happens next, what move gets made once this point is reached, matters far less than it might seem to in the moment you're standing inside it. This piece will address the patterns that sometimes follow, honestly and without dramatizing them, but its real subject is you, this moment, and what it means for the life you're about to build on the other side of it. What a breaking point actually is. A breaking point is not a dramatic collapse, though it's often imagined that way. It's not a single explosive moment where everything falls apart all at once, dramatic and cinematic and clearly marked. Far more often, it's quiet, almost anticlimactic, the moment you simply stop being willing to keep absorbing something you've been absorbing for a long time. It might arrive after one disappointment too many, the straw that reveals a structure that had already been unsustainable for a long time before it finally gave way. It might arrive without any single triggering event at all, simply the slow accumulation of exhaustion finally reaching a threshold you didn't consciously set but recognized the moment you cross it. What makes a breaking point different from an ordinary bad day, an ordinary frustration, is the clarity that comes with it. Before the breaking point, there's usually still some ambivalence, some hope that things might improve, some willingness to keep trying a little longer. After the breaking point, that ambivalence tends to dissolve, replaced by a clean, unmistakable knowing that you're done, not out of anger necessarily, though anger might be present, but out of simple, exhausted certainty that continuing isn't something you're willing to do anymore. This clarity is valuable, even though reaching it usually costs a great deal. It cuts through months or years of uncertainty, replacing endless deliberation with a decision that once made tends to feel remarkably stable, resistant to the kind of second-guessing that characterized so much of what came before it. If you've reached this point, trust it. It didn't arrive lightly, and it doesn't need to be relitigated every time old doubt tries to resurface. Why the question of their next move is worth examining honestly. It's worth pausing on the question this piece's title raises, not to avoid it, but to look directly at what it reveals about where your attention still is. Wondering what someone's next move will be once they sense you've reached your limit is a completely understandable question, especially if you've been in a dynamic long enough to recognize patterns, to notice that certain kinds of distance in the past have provoked certain kinds of responses. But it's worth being honest that this question, however natural, still orients your attention outward toward them, toward anticipating and preparing for something they might or might not do, rather than fully inward, toward the breaking point itself and what it means for you. This isn't a criticism. Anticipating someone's reaction is a normal, protective instinct, especially after a relationship where their reactions may have significantly shaped your own choices for a long time. But it's worth naming clearly, because the real power available to you right now doesn't actually depend on correctly predicting what happens next. It depends on how solidly you can stand in your own clarity regardless of what does or doesn't happen on their end. This piece will address common patterns honestly, but it will keep returning deliberately to this central point. Your steadiness doesn't require accurate prediction. It only requires your own continued commitment to the boundary you've already, painfully, earned the right to hold. General patterns worth understanding, without assuming they all apply. It's useful, for the sake of protecting yourself, to understand some general patterns that sometimes show up when someone senses they're losing access to a person who has previously accommodated a great deal. Patterns documented broadly in relational psychology rather than specific predictions about any one particular person. These patterns exist on a spectrum, and not everyone exhibits all or even any of them. Understanding them is meant to help you feel less confused if something familiar shows up, not to convince you that a specific outcome is guaranteed. Sometimes when someone senses a partner's withdrawal has become serious, there's an increase in contact or effort that hadn't been present in a long time, a sudden attentiveness that can feel, on the surface, like exactly the change you'd once hoped for. This isn't necessarily insincere, and it isn't necessarily sustainable either. Sometimes it reflects a genuine moment of clarity about what's being lost. Sometimes it reflects a more reflexive response to the discomfort of losing access to something familiar, without any accompanying shift in the deeper patterns that led to the breaking point in the first place. There's no way to know in the moment which of these is happening, and it's worth being honest with yourself about that uncertainty rather than assuming you can definitively read the intention behind any change in behavior. Other times, a person's response to sensing a partner's breaking point involves withdrawal rather than increased effort, a further retreat rather than a re-engagement, as though confirming distance preemptively feels safer than risking further investment in something that already feels precarious. Both of these patterns and others that don't fit neatly into either category are possible, and neither one should be treated as a certainty you need to brace for in advance. What matters far more than predicting which pattern might show up is your own clarity about what you need regardless of which one does. Why anticipating their move keeps you stuck? There's a specific cost to spending significant energy trying to anticipate and prepare for someone else's possible reactions, a cost that's easy to underestimate because the anticipating itself can feel productive, like a form of protecting yourself in advance. But this kind of anticipatory bracing keeps a significant portion of your attention oriented toward them, toward their potential behavior, their potential feelings, their potential response to your own clarity, rather than fully oriented toward your own healing and your own next steps. This orientation, however understandable, delays a shift that ultimately needs to happen for your own peace. The shift from organizing your emotional life around their behavior to organizing it around your own values, needs, and decisions. As long as a meaningful portion of your attention remains focused on guessing what they'll do next, you remain, in some sense, still oriented around them, still granting their potential actions a significant amount of power over your own emotional state, even in the very moment you're trying to separate from them. Recognizing this pattern doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong by wondering what might happen next. It simply means noticing where your attention is going and gently, repeatedly, redirecting it back toward what actually matters most right now. Your own clarity, your own next steps, your own healing, none of which actually depends on correctly predicting anyone else's behavior in order to move forward fully and completely. What actually matters, your own steadiness. If there's a single skill worth building right now, more valuable than any amount of pattern recognition or prediction, it's steadiness, the capacity to hold your own clarity regardless of what happens externally. Steadiness doesn't mean feeling nothing. It doesn't mean being unaffected by whatever does or doesn't happen next. It means having enough of a foundation in your own values and your own decision that external events, whatever they turn out to be, don't have the power to completely dislodge you from the clarity you've worked so hard to reach. Building this steadiness starts with getting explicit, even just for yourself, about exactly why you reached this breaking point, what specifically became unsustainable, what you need going forward regardless of how anyone else responds. Having this clarity articulated, even just in your own private reflection, gives you something solid to return to whenever uncertainty arises, whenever an old doubt tries to resurface, whenever something happens that tempts you to second-guess a decision that was made for good, well-considered reasons. This steadiness is what actually protects you, far more than any accurate prediction of someone else's next move ever could. A person standing on solid, well-understood ground doesn't need to correctly anticipate every possible external event in order to remain standing. They simply need the ground itself to be solid, and building that solid ground within yourself, independent of anyone else's behavior, is the real work available to you right now. Building an internal response plan independent of their behavior. Rather than trying to predict specifically what will happen next, it can be more useful to build a general internal response plan, a clear sense of how you intend to handle various categories of possible outcomes, without needing to know in advance which specific outcome will actually occur. This means deciding in advance how you'll respond if increased contact arrives, what your standard will be for determining whether any change in behavior reflects genuine, sustained growth versus a reflexive reaction to losing access. It means deciding how you'll respond if withdrawal deepens instead, what support you'll lean on, what you'll do with the space that opens up. Having this kind of general plan, built around categories of response rather than specific predictions, gives you a sense of preparedness without requiring the impossible task of correctly guessing exactly what will happen. It also protects you from being caught completely off guard by any particular outcome, because you've already thought through, in advance, how you intend to handle whatever category it falls into, regardless of its specific details. This kind of preparation is valuable precisely because it keeps your attention appropriately balanced, acknowledging that something might happen without requiring you to obsess over exactly what that something will be. It allows you to move forward with your own life, your own healing, your own next steps, while still holding enough general preparedness that you won't be destabilized by whatever eventually does or doesn't occur. Recognizing manipulation patterns for protection, not prediction. It's worth addressing directly a category of behavior that sometimes shows up when someone senses they're losing access to a relationship they'd grown comfortable relying on. Behavior that can look, on the surface, like genuine change, but that, on closer examination, functions primarily to restore access rather than to address the underlying issues that led to the breaking point in the first place. This might look like grand gestures without corresponding follow-through, promises made in a moment of urgency that don't hold up once that urgency has passed, or an intensity of contact that fades as soon as the immediate threat of losing access has been resolved. Understanding these patterns isn't about assuming the worst of everyone or treating every instance of renewed effort with automatic suspicion. It's about protecting yourself with a reasonable framework for evaluation. Does this change hold up over time, through repetition, through the ordinary friction of continued interaction, or does it fade once the immediate pressure that produced it has eased? Genuine change tends to be demonstrated through sustained, consistent behavior over a meaningful period of time, not through a single dramatic gesture or a burst of renewed attention that coincides suspiciously with the moment you finally set a boundary. This framework protects you without requiring you to assume malicious intent on anyone's part. Someone can genuinely want to change and still fail to sustain that change over time, simply because the underlying work required for lasting change is much harder and much slower than a single moment of motivated effort can produce. Holding this framework, waiting for sustained evidence rather than being persuaded by a single gesture, protects your own boundary without requiring you to make any definitive judgment about anyone's character or intentions. The peace of not needing to guess. There's a specific, significant peace available once you stop needing to correctly guess what happens next in order to feel settled in your own decision. This peace doesn't depend on prediction at all. It depends entirely on the strength of your own clarity, built independently of anything external, sturdy enough to hold regardless of whatever specific events eventually unfold. Reaching this peace means shifting your energy away from trying to anticipate every possible scenario and towards simply, repeatedly, returning to your own well-considered reasons for the boundary you've set. This shift takes practice, especially if anticipating others' reactions has been a long-standing habit developed over a relationship where those reactions significantly shaped your own choices. But it's a shift worth making deliberately, because the alternative, staying perpetually oriented toward guessing and preparing for someone else's potential behavior, keeps you tethered to them in a way that delays your own full movement forward, regardless of how clear your underlying decision actually is. Practice returning whenever the urge to guess or predict arises to a simple, grounding question: what do I need, regardless of what they do? This question redirects your attention back to the only thing that's actually within your control, and answering it clearly, repeatedly, is what ultimately produces the peace this section describes. A peace built on your own solid ground, rather than on any accurate forecast of someone else's uncertain future behavior. Why breaking points are usually earned, not sudden. It's worth naming clearly that a breaking point, however sudden it might feel in the specific moment it arrives, is almost never actually sudden in any real sense. It's the visible surface of a much longer accumulation, months or years of small disappointments, small compromises, small moments of settling for less than you actually needed, all building quietly until they finally produce the clear, unmistakable clarity you're now standing inside. Understanding this helps counter a specific kind of self-doubt that sometimes arises after reaching a breaking point, the worry that you're overreacting to something that, viewed in isolation, might not seem significant enough to justify such a definitive response. Your breaking point was never actually about any single isolated incident, even if a single incident happened to be the final trigger that made the accumulated weight finally undeniable. It was about the full weight of everything that came before it, the pattern, the repetition, the slow erosion of your own patience and goodwill that occurred gradually enough that you might not have fully registered its cumulative significance until it finally, unmistakably, tipped the scale. Trusting this accumulated weight, rather than second-guessing yourself based on the specific triggering incident alone, is an important part of trusting the breaking point itself as valid and earned. This understanding matters because it protects you from a particular kind of doubt that can otherwise creep in during moments of uncertainty. The worry that you're being unreasonable, that the specific final straw wasn't actually significant enough to justify everything that's followed. It was significant enough not on its own, but as the visible tip of an accumulated pattern that had already, long before that final moment, made this breaking point inevitable. Grieving what led to the breaking point. Before this piece moves further into what comes after the breaking point, it's worth pausing to acknowledge the grief that often accompanies reaching it, a grief that's easy to skip past in favor of focusing on strength, boundaries, and moving forward, but that deserves genuine space nonetheless. Reaching a breaking point means acknowledging, clearly and without more room for denial, that something you hoped would work simply isn't going to work, at least not in the form it's taken so far. This acknowledgement carries real loss, even when the breaking point itself represents a necessary and healthy shift. You may grieve the version of the relationship you once believed was possible, the future you'd imagined, the effort you invested that didn't produce the outcome you were hoping for. You may grieve the version of yourself who believed, for a long time, that enough patience or enough love could change the outcome, only to discover, through direct and difficult experience, that this wasn't true. This grief is not a sign of weakness or a sign that your breaking point is somehow less valid. It's simply the natural, appropriate response to a real loss, and it deserves to be felt rather than rushed past in favor of an artificially cheerful narrative about empowerment and boundaries alone. Give yourself permission to feel this grief fully, alongside whatever clarity and strength you're also building through this process. Both can coexist. The breaking point can be exactly the right decision and still carry real sadness about what led to it and what's being lost as a result. Honoring this complexity, rather than flattening it into a simpler, more triumphant story, tends to produce more complete, more durable healing than skipping past the grief ever could. What a breaking point protects you from. It's worth naming clearly what reaching this breaking point actually protects you from, because understanding this can help reinforce your confidence in the decision during moments when doubt tries to resurface. A breaking point protects you from continuing to invest in a pattern that has already demonstrated, repeatedly, that it isn't going to change through your continued patience or effort alone. It protects you from the specific cumulative cost of staying in an unsustainable dynamic indefinitely, a cost that compounds the longer it continues, eroding not just your peace in this specific relationship, but your broader sense of your own worth, your own judgment, and your own right to expect better. It protects you, too, from the particular exhaustion of continuing to hope for a change that evidence suggests isn't coming, freeing up the energy that hope was consuming for something more productive. Your own healing, your own growth, your own life, finally centered on your own needs, rather than on the ongoing project of trying to make an unsustainable dynamic work through sheer effort and payday. NCE alone, understanding what this breaking point protects you from helps reframe it as an act of self-preservation rather than simply an ending, a giving up, or a failure. It is, in fact, the opposite of failure. It's the clear-eyed recognition of a pattern that wasn't serving you, and the decision, difficult but necessary, to finally stop participating in it. This reframe is worth returning to whenever doubt arises, replacing any lingering sense of failure with a more accurate understanding of exactly what this decision is actually protecting you from. Boundaries as the actual move that matters. If this piece's title asks what their next move will be, the more useful question, the one actually within your control, is what your own next move looks like, specifically in terms of the boundaries you're prepared to hold regardless of anything that happens externally. A boundary in this context isn't a threat or an ultimatum designed to provoke a particular response from someone else. It's simply a clear statement to yourself first and foremost about what you will and won't continue to accept, held steady regardless of whatever reaction it does or doesn't produce. Building this boundary clearly in your own mind before any specific external event forces you to articulate it reactively gives you a stable foundation to return to no matter what unfolds next. It might mean deciding clearly how much contact, if any, you're willing to maintain going forward. It might mean deciding what specific behaviors would need to be sustained, over what period of time, before any reconsideration of the relationship's terms would even become possible. Having this boundary articulated clearly, independent of any specific triggering event, protects you from having to construct it reactively, under pressure, in a moment when clear thinking might be harder to access. This is the real move that matters here, more than anything that happens on their end. Your boundary, held steadily and consistently regardless of external events, is the actual determining factor in how this next chapter of your life unfolds. Everything else, whatever specific pattern eventually plays out on their side, is secondary to the strength and consistency of the boundary you've built for yourself. What to do regardless of their response. It's worth laying out clearly in practical terms what actually deserves your energy and attention right now, regardless of whatever specific response eventually comes from the other side of this boundary. This means investing in your own support system, reaching out to friends and family who can offer the kind of steady presence that helps reinforce your own clarity during a period when it might otherwise waver. It means investing in your own routines, the practical structures of daily life, sleep, movement, nourishment that tend to suffer during periods of high emotional intensity and that deserve deliberate protection precisely because they support the steadiness this entire process requires. It also means investing in whatever processing this experience actually requires, whether that's journaling, therapy, conversations with trusted people, or simply quiet reflection, giving yourself the space to fully understand and integrate what led to this breaking point rather than rushing past it toward whatever comes next. This processing isn't wasted time. It's the actual work of healing, and it deserves genuine investment regardless of how anyone else responds to the boundary you've set. None of this depends on correctly predicting anyone else's next move. All of it is available to you right now, regardless of what does or doesn't happen externally, and investing in it fully is far more productive than spending that same energy trying to anticipate or control something that was never actually within your power to determine in the first place. The strength that outlasts any specific reaction. There's a specific kind of strength available to you now, different from the strength required to reach this breaking point in the first place. A strength built not around any single confrontation or decision, but around your ongoing capacity to hold your own clarity across whatever unfolds in the days, weeks, and months ahead. This strength doesn't require you to correctly predict what happens next. It simply requires your continued commitment to the boundary and the clarity you've already built, renewed daily, through the ordinary practice of choosing yourself again and again, regardless of external circumstances. This ongoing strength is more valuable, ultimately, than any single dramatic moment of standing your ground, because it's what actually determines whether the clarity you've reached holds up over time, through whatever tests it eventually faces. A boundary held once in a single dramatic confrontation means little if it isn't also held consistently afterward, through the quieter, less dramatic moments when old habits or old hopes might otherwise pull you back toward patterns you've already recognized as unsustainable. Building this ongoing strength happens the same way every other part of this process happens. Through repeated practice, through choosing the boundary again each time it's tested, through returning to your own clarity whenever doubt or uncertainty arises. This is the real work ahead of you, more important than anything that happens on the other side of this dynamic, and it's entirely within your power to build, regardless of any specific external event. Building trust in your own limits. Part of what this breaking point ultimately teaches, beyond anything specific about this particular relationship, is a deeper trust in your own limits, a recognition that your capacity for patience, however generous, is not infinite, and that reaching its edge is not a failure but simply accurate information about what you can and cannot sustainably tolerate. This trust in your own limits is valuable far beyond this specific situation, informing how you navigate every future relationship, every future demand on your patience and your emotional resources. Learning to trust your limits means no longer treating your own exhaustion as something to override through sheer willpower, no longer assuming that reaching a breaking point reflects some failure of character rather than simply an accurate, honest signal that something needs to change. This trust develops through direct experience, through living through exactly what you're living through now, and it becomes, over time, one of the more valuable and protective forms of self-knowledge you carry forward into every future relationship and situation that tests your patience going forward. This trust also protects you from repeating the pattern that led to this specific breaking point, recognizing earlier, in future situations, the signs that you're approaching a similar edge, and addressing those signs proactively rather than waiting until exhaustion has fully set in before finally taking action. This is one of the most valuable, practical outcomes available from everything you're going through right now, a form of wisdom that will serve you reliably for the rest of your life. What healing looks like after the breaking point. Healing after reaching a breaking point doesn't happen in a straight line, and it's worth naming this clearly so that the inevitable difficult days don't feel like evidence that something has gone wrong. There will likely be days when the clarity you've built feels completely solid, unshakable, easy to access without any real effort. There will also likely be days when old doubt resurfaces, when you find yourself wondering whether you made the right decision, when a wave of grief or loneliness makes the boundary you've set feel harder to maintain than it did the day before. Both kinds of days are part of the same overall healing process, and neither one should be treated as more meaningful or more indicative of your true feelings than the other. Healing tends to look in practice like a gradual lengthening of the good days and a gradual shortening of the difficult ones, not a sudden, permanent shift from struggle to peace, but a slow recalibration that takes real time to fully settle. Trust this gradual process, even when it feels frustratingly slow, understanding that the destination, real and lasting peace with the decision you've made, is genuinely reachable even when any single difficult day makes it feel distant or uncertain. Part of this healing also involves rebuilding a life that isn't organized around this relationship at all, redirecting the energy and attention that used to go toward managing this dynamic into pursuits, relationships, and goals that have nothing to do with it. This redirection is one of the clearest markers of genuine healing, more reliable in many ways than any specific feeling about the relationship itself, because it reflects the practical, measurable ways your life is actually moving forward, regardless of anything that does or doesn't happen on the other side of the boundary you've set. The difference between hoping and waiting. It's worth drawing a clear distinction between two things that can feel similar but that lead to very different outcomes: hoping that someone eventually changes, and waiting for that change before you allow yourself to move forward with your own life. Hope, held loosely, doesn't have to interfere with your own healing. You can hold a general, undemanding hope that someone eventually grows, addresses their own patterns, becomes capable of the kind of relationship you needed, without that hope requiring anything from you in the meantime, without it keeping you tethered to a specific timeline or a specific outcome you're actively waiting to witness. Waiting is different. Waiting means putting your own life, your own healing, your own forward movement on hold, contingent on some specific external development that may or may not ever actually arrive. Waiting keeps you tethered in a way that hope, held loosely, doesn't have to. If you notice yourself waiting rather than simply, loosely hoping, it's worth examining that distinction honestly, redirecting your energy back toward your own life rather than continuing to hold it hostage to an uncertain, unpredictable external timeline that was never actually within your control to influence in the first place. Releasing the waiting while still allowing yourself whatever loose, undemanding hope feels natural is one of the more practical shifts available to you now, protecting your own forward movement from being indefinitely delayed by uncertainty about something that was never actually yours to control or predict with any real confidence. When someone actually does change, it's worth addressing directly what happens in the less common but genuinely possible scenario where someone actually does undertake real, sustained change following a breaking point like the one you've reached, because dismissing this possibility entirely would be just as inaccurate as assuming it's guaranteed. Real change, when it happens, tends to look different from the patterns of reflexive escalation or withdrawal described earlier in this piece. It tends to be demonstrated through sustained, consistent action over a meaningful period of time, often including visible evidence of the actual internal work required to produce lasting change, therapy, honest self-examination, a track record of handling difficult moments differently than before. If this kind of genuine change does eventually occur, it's worth deciding, in advance and with a clear mind, what your own standard will be for evaluating it, rather than making that evaluation reactively, under the emotional pressure of the moment. This might mean requiring a specific period of consistent, demonstrated behavior before reconsidering any change to the boundaries you've set. It might mean requiring evidence of actual professional support or sustained self-work, rather than simply promises or a temporary increase in effort. Having this standard clearly articulated in advance protects you from being persuaded prematurely by a change that hasn't yet had the chance to prove itself sustainable. Whether or not this scenario ever actually unfolds, holding a clear, reasonable standard for what genuine change would actually require protects you either way, ensuring that any eventual reconsideration of the relationship's terms is based on solid, demonstrated evidence rather than on hope, urgency, or a single compelling moment that hasn't yet been tested by time. The confusion of mixed signals. One of the more disorienting experiences that can follow a breaking point is receiving mixed signals, moments of apparent care or reconsideration interspersed with continued patterns of the same behavior that led to the breaking point in the first place. This mixture can be genuinely confusing, making it harder to hold on to the clarity you've built, because it doesn't fit neatly into either the story of someone who clearly doesn't care or the story of someone who has clearly, sustainably changed. It's worth naming this confusion directly rather than pretending it doesn't exist, because pretending clarity is simpler than it actually feels in these moments doesn't serve your healing. Mixed signals are genuinely disorienting, and it's reasonable to feel unsettled by them even while still holding firmly to the boundary you've set. Holding both of these things simultaneously, the disorientation of mixed signals and the continued firmness of your boundary, is possible, even though it doesn't feel entirely comfortable while you're doing it. When mixed signals arise, it can help to return to the standard you've already articulated for what genuine, sustained change would actually require, using that standard as a stable reference point rather than trying to resolve the confusion of each individual mixed signal in isolation. Individual moments, taken one at a time, will often remain genuinely ambiguous. The pattern over time, evaluated against your own clear standard, is what actually matters, and returning to that broader pattern, rather than getting lost in the confusion of any single moment, is what will ultimately help you navigate this disorienting period most effectively. Why you don't owe anyone a warning. It's worth addressing a specific question that sometimes arises during this period: whether you owe the other person some kind of formal warning or explanation before fully enforcing the boundary you've reached. The answer, generally, is no. You don't owe an exhaustive explanation, a formal warning, or an opportunity to course correct before you're allowed to fully honor your own limits. Your breaking point, as this piece has described throughout, was likely earned over a long period of accumulated evidence the other person had ample opportunity to notice and respond to before it reached this point. This isn't about punishing anyone or withholding fairness. It's simply a recognition that boundaries don't require advance notice or formal warning in order to be legitimate. You are allowed to simply reach your limit and act accordingly, without first providing a detailed roadmap of exactly what would need to change and by when in order to avoid this outcome. If you choose to communicate your reasoning, that's a legitimate choice too, but it's a choice, not an obligation, and you're equally entitled to simply hold your boundary without extensive explanation if that feels like the healthier path for you. Releasing any sense of obligation to provide advance warning or exhaustive justification protects you from delaying your own necessary action out of a misplaced sense of fairness towards someone who has already had ample time and evidence to understand what was needed, whether or not they chose to act on that understanding while there was still time to do so. Trusting yourself when no one else understands. There may be people around you, even well-meaning ones, who don't immediately understand the depth of the breaking point you've reached, who might suggest you're being too harsh, too quick to give up, too unwilling to extend the kind of patience they imagine they'd extend in your position. This lack of understanding, however well-intentioned, doesn't invalidate your own clear-eyed assessment of a situation you lived through directly, in ways no one observing from the outside can fully appreciate. Trust your own assessment over any external skepticism, understanding that you have access to information, the accumulated pattern of small disappointments and compromises that led to this point, that no outside observer can fully see or evaluate as accurately as you can. This doesn't mean dismissing all outside perspective entirely, but it does mean holding your own lived experience as the primary, most reliable source of information about whether this breaking point is valid and whether the boundary you've set is appropriate. If you find yourself needing external validation in order to feel confident in your own decision, it's worth examining that need honestly, recognizing that ultimately, your own clear assessment of your own experience is sufficient justification for the boundary you've set, regardless of whether everyone around you immediately understands or agrees with it. The body's response to reaching a limit. It's worth attending to the physical experience of reaching a breaking point, because the body often processes this kind of significant shift alongside, and sometimes ahead of, the mind's conscious understanding of what's happening. You may notice in the aftermath of reaching this point a specific kind of exhaustion, deeper than ordinary tiredness, reflecting the cumulative toll of everything that led up to this moment finally being acknowledged rather than continuing to be pushed through. You may also notice, alongside that exhaustion, a kind of physical relief, a loosening in your chest or shoulders that reflects your body's own recognition that something unsustainable has finally been named and addressed. Paying attention to these physical signals, rather than dismissing them in favor of purely cognitive processing, can offer valuable information about where you actually stand in this process, information that sometimes proves more reliable than your conscious thoughts, especially during periods when mixed signals or lingering doubt make cognitive clarity harder to access consistently. If your body feels more settled, more able to rest, more capable of deep breath, that's meaningful evidence of genuine relief, regardless of whatever cognitive uncertainty might still be present. Give your body time and space to process this significant shift through rest, through movement, through whatever physical practices help you feel more grounded and present. This physical processing is not separate from the emotional and cognitive work this piece has described throughout. It's an integral part of the same overall healing process, deserving genuine attention and care alongside everything else you're working through right now. What this breaking point reveals about your own growth. It's worth pausing to recognize what the simple fact of reaching this breaking point actually reveals about your own growth, independent of anything happening on the other side of this dynamic. Reaching a genuine breaking point, rather than continuing indefinitely to absorb an unsustainable pattern, requires a kind of self-respect and self-awareness that doesn't develop automatically. It requires recognizing your own limits clearly enough to name them, and it requires enough belief in your own worth to act on that recognition rather than continuing to override it indefinitely out of hope, fear, or simple habit. This growth deserves to be acknowledged directly, not overshadowed entirely by uncertainty about what happens next. You have grown measurably and significantly simply by reaching the point of clarity you're standing inside right now, regardless of anything that does or doesn't happen externally as a result. This growth is yours permanently, a genuine outcome of everything you've lived through, and it will continue to serve you, informing how you handle future situations that test your patience and your limits, long after this specific chapter has resolved itself in whatever way it eventually does. Take a moment to actually recognize this growth, rather than moving too quickly past it toward anxious anticipation of what comes next. You are, in a real and measurable sense, a stronger, more self-aware person for having reached this point, and that growth remains real and valuable regardless of anything else that happens from here forward. Preparing for the possibility of silence. One specific outcome worth addressing directly, because it's common and can be particularly disorienting if you haven't consciously prepared for it, is the possibility that nothing dramatic happens at all, that silence, rather than any specific escalation or reconciliation attempt, follows the boundary you've set. This outcome can feel strange, sometimes even more disorienting than a more dramatic response would be, because it denies you any clear external signal about what your boundary actually meant to the other person. If silence is what follows, it's worth resisting the urge to interpret that silence as definitive proof of anything specific, whether that interpretation leans toward assuming it confirms they never cared at all, or toward assuming it reflects some deeper process happening invisibly on their end. Silence, on its own, doesn't actually tell you much of anything reliable. It's simply an absence of information, and treating it as more meaningful than it actually is, in either direction, risks pulling you back into the same pattern of trying to interpret and predict behavior that this piece has already cautioned against throughout. If silence is what you encounter, let it simply be silence, an absence rather than a message, and continue focusing your energy on your own healing and your own life regardless of what that silence does or doesn't eventually mean. This is, in many ways, one of the more freeing outcomes available, because it removes the temptation to keep monitoring for signals, allowing you to redirect your full attention back toward your own forward movement without the ongoing distraction of trying to interpret an unclear external response. The practical shape of the days ahead. It's worth translating everything this piece has described into something more concrete, the actual practical shape of the days immediately ahead of you, because abstract understanding becomes most useful when it informs specific, actionable choices. In the days ahead, it's worth deliberately structuring time in ways that support your own stability, maintaining routines around sleep, meals, and movement, even when motivation for any of it feels lower than usual. It's worth reaching out proactively to people who can offer steady support, rather than waiting until you're in acute distress to ask for help. It's worth, too, limiting the amount of time spent monitoring for any external signal about what's happening on the other side of this boundary, whether that means limiting how often you check your phone, how often you look at shared social spaces, how often you allow your mind to circle back to speculation about what might be happening. This isn't about suppressing natural curiosity entirely, but about noticing when that curiosity has become a significant drain on your energy and attention, and deliberately redirecting that energy back toward your own life instead. These practical steps, small and unglamorous as they might seem compared to the larger emotional and psychological work this piece has described, are actually where a great deal of real healing happens, in the accumulated texture of ordinary days handled with intention and care rather than left to unfold reactively, shaped entirely by whatever external events do or don't occur. What other people in this position have learned. It's worth offering some general, hard-won wisdom from the broader pattern of people who have navigated situations similar to the one you're in now, insight drawn from common threads rather than any single specific case. Many people looking back after significant time has passed report that the anticipation and anxiety leading up to and immediately following a breaking point like this tends to be more intense than whatever actually followed it, whichever direction that following took. The uncertainty itself, in other words, often proves harder to bear than the eventual resolution, whatever form that resolution ultimately takes. Many also report that the specific details of what happened next, whatever pattern it followed, mattered less to their own long-term healing than they expected it to in the moment. What mattered more looking back was their own consistency in holding the boundary they'd set, their own investment in rebuilding a life that didn't depend on this relationship, their own gradual return to a stable, self-respecting sense of their own worth, independent of anything the other person did or didn't do in response. This broader pattern, drawn from many individual experiences rather than any single case, offers a kind of general reassurance worth holding on to during this uncertain period. Whatever specific thing happens next, your own healing and your own forward movement remain within your control, and they tend to matter more in the long run than whatever specific external event you might currently be anxiously anticipating. Redefining strength for this specific moment. It's worth offering a final, clear redefinition of strength as it applies specifically to this moment, because the version of strength that got you to this breaking point, the strength required to finally name an unsustainable pattern and set a boundary around it, is not necessarily the same version of strength you'll need in the days and weeks that follow. That initial strength was decisive, clarifying, action-oriented. The strength required now is quieter, more sustained, less about a single decisive moment and more about the ongoing, daily practice of holding steady regardless of whatever happens externally. This quieter strength looks like continuing to invest in your own life even during days when doubt or grief make that investment feel harder than usual. It looks like resisting the urge to seek premature resolution, whether through reaching out yourself or through anxiously monitoring for signals from the other side. It looks like trusting the process of gradual healing this piece has described throughout, even when that process feels slower or less linear than you might prefer. Building this quieter, more sustained strength is the real work ahead of you now, more important than any specific prediction about what happens next, more valuable than any single dramatic confrontation or decision. It's built the same way every other form of strength described throughout this piece is built, through repeated practice, through patience with yourself, through the accumulated choice made again and again to hold steady in the clarity you've already, painfully, earned the right to claim. The question underneath the question. If you dig beneath the question of what their next move will be, there's often a deeper, more vulnerable question underneath it, something closer to, does this mean I mattered? Will they finally understand what they're losing? Will my breaking point be the thing that finally makes them see clearly what they couldn't see before? This deeper question deserves honesty, because it reflects a genuine, understandable hope that your significance in this relationship will finally be recognized, that your worth will finally be confirmed by their reaction to almost losing you. It's worth naming this hope directly rather than letting it operate invisibly underneath the more surface-level question about specific behavior. And it's worth offering a gentle but honest response to it. Your worth was never actually contingent on their eventual recognition of it, however satisfying that recognition might feel if it ever arrives. You mattered genuinely throughout this relationship, independent of whether that mattering is ever fully reflected back to you in the specific way you might be hoping for now. Their eventual understanding, or lack of it, doesn't actually determine the truth of your own worth, which remains constant regardless of anyone else's capacity to fully perceive or honor it. Releasing this deeper hope, or at least holding it loosely rather than needing it fulfilled in order to feel settled in your own worth, is one of the more significant, though difficult, pieces of healing available to you now. Your value was never actually up for their determination, and building a peace that doesn't depend on their eventual recognition is far more durable and far more within your control than continuing to wait for a confirmation that may never arrive in the specific form you're hoping for. Choosing yourself in the absence of certainty. Everything this piece has described ultimately asks something significant of you, the willingness to choose yourself clearly and consistently in the absence of certainty about what happens next. This is genuinely difficult because most of us are more comfortable making decisions once we have full information, once we know exactly how things will unfold, once we can weigh the actual outcome rather than simply the possibility of various outcomes. But this kind of full certainty isn't available to you right now, and waiting for it before fully committing to your own boundary would mean waiting indefinitely, potentially forever, for a certainty that external circumstances were never actually going to provide. Choosing yourself in this uncertainty means holding your boundary not because you're certain what happens next, but because you're certain about what you need regardless of what happens next. This is a different, more durable kind of certainty than the kind you might be searching for when you wonder about their next move. It's certainty about your own values, your own limits, your own worth, all of which remain stable and knowable even when the external situation remains genuinely uncertain. This is the real invitation underneath everything this piece has described, not to correctly predict an uncertain future, but to build enough certainty about your own needs and values that the external uncertainty becomes something you can hold steady through, rather than something that destabilizes your entire sense of what to do next. This is available to you right now, regardless of anything else, and it's the single most valuable thing you can build during this period. A reflection on timing. It's worth acknowledging that everything this piece has described unfolds according to its own timeline, different for everyone, shaped by countless individual factors that have little to do with how thoroughly you understand any of the concepts this piece has offered. Some people move through this process of holding a boundary and building forward momentum relatively quickly. Others take much longer, moving through periods of doubt, periods of renewed hope, periods of grief that resurface unexpectedly even well after the initial breaking point has passed. Neither pace reflects anything meaningful about your strength or your ultimate capacity to reach the steady, self-respecting peace this piece has described throughout. Be patient with your own particular timeline, resisting any urge to measure your progress against some imagined standard of how quickly this process is supposed to unfold. What matters is not speed but direction, the gradual, consistent movement toward greater clarity and stability, even when that movement feels uneven or interrupted by difficult days along the way. Trust that direction, even during the moments it's hardest to feel, understanding that the destination remains available to you regardless of how long the specific journey toward it takes in your own particular case. What you're actually building right now. Beyond the specific relationship and the specific boundary this piece has been discussing throughout, it's worth naming what you're actually building right now, in a broader sense, through everything you're navigating during this period. You're building a template, an internal model for how you handle reaching your own limits going forward, one that will inform every future relationship and situation that tests your patience in similar ways. You're building evidence, direct and personal, that you're capable of recognizing an unsustainable pattern and acting on that recognition, evidence that will support your own confidence in future decisions long after this particular chapter has resolved. You're building, too, a clearer sense of your own worth, one that doesn't depend on any single relationship's outcome or on anyone else's eventual recognition of what they're losing. This sense of worth, built through the difficult work of holding a boundary even amid uncertainty and doubt, becomes a permanent resource, carried forward into everything you do next, informing not just future relationships but your broader relationship with yourself and your own capacity to trust your own judgment. This is the real, lasting outcome of everything you're going through right now, more significant and more durable than whatever specific pattern eventually plays out on the other side of this particular boundary. You are building yourself right now in real time through the accumulated choices this difficult period is asking of you, and that building matters more than any single external event ever could. The relief of no longer bracing. There's a specific relief available once you stop bracing for a particular outcome, once you allow yourself to simply exist inside the uncertainty of this period without constantly monitoring for signs of what's coming next. Bracing, however understandable as an instinct, keeps your nervous system in a state of ongoing tension, always slightly on alert, always slightly prepared for something that may or may not actually arrive in the form you're anticipating. Releasing this bracing, even gradually and imperfectly, offers real physical and emotional relief, a chance for your system to actually rest rather than remaining perpetually poised for a reaction that hasn't happened yet and might never happen in the way you're expecting. This release doesn't require you to stop caring about the outcome entirely, and it doesn't require pretending you have no feelings about what might happen next. It simply means loosening the grip of constant anticipation, allowing yourself to exist more fully in the present moment, attending to your actual current life rather than remaining perpetually oriented toward a future you can't actually control or predict with any real accuracy. Practice this release deliberately whenever you notice yourself bracing, gently redirecting your attention back to what's actually happening right now, in this present moment, rather than continuing to brace for something that remains, by its nature, genuinely uncertain regardless of how much anticipatory energy you spend trying to prepare for it in advance. Closing reflections on what matters most. As this piece moves toward its conclusion, it's worth returning to the central truth underneath everything it has described. What matters most right now is not correctly predicting anyone else's next move, but building and maintaining your own steady, self-respecting clarity, regardless of whatever does or doesn't happen externally. This clarity is available to you fully right now, independent of any external event, built out of your own accumulated experience, your own values, and your own hard-won understanding of what you need going forward. You have already done the hardest part, reaching this breaking point, naming clearly what has become unsustainable, and beginning the process of holding a boundary around it. Everything else, whatever specific pattern eventually plays out on the other side, is secondary to this central achievement, which belongs entirely to you and remains yours regardless of anything else that happens next. Trust this achievement, trust your own clarity, and continue building forward one day at a time, regardless of whatever uncertain external events this period continues to present, knowing that your own steady, consistent choice to honor your own limits is, in the end, far more powerful and far more determinative of your future than any specific move anyone else might or might not eventually make. What friends and family can offer right now. It's worth naming directly the specific, practical role your support system can play during this particular period, because the people around you often want to help, but aren't always sure exactly what kind of help would actually be most useful. What tends to help most isn't advice about what the other person will probably do next. Speculation that, however well-intentioned, tends to pull your attention back into the same anxious anticipation this piece has been encouraging you to release. What tends to help most is steady, practical presence, someone to sit with you without needing to solve anything, someone to help with ordinary daily tasks during a period when your own capacity for them might be temporarily reduced, someone who reinforces your own clarity rather than introducing new doubt or new speculation. If the people around you tend toward speculation rather than steady presence, it's worth naming that directly, letting them know what kind of support would actually be most helpful right now, rather than assuming they should already know or feeling obligated to accept whatever form of support they happen to offer even when it doesn't actually serve your healing. Most people, once they understand what's actually needed, are glad to adjust the kind of support they're offering, and asking for exactly what you need is a reasonable, healthy request, not an imposition. Lean on this support deliberately during this period, understanding that navigating a breaking point like this alone, without any steady outside presence, is significantly harder than navigating it with genuine support, and that reaching out for that support reflects strength and self-awareness rather than any kind of weakness or dependency. The value of writing this down. It's worth suggesting directly, as a practical tool, the value of writing down your own clear reasoning for this breaking point, in your own words, at a time when your thinking feels relatively clear and settled. This written record becomes a valuable resource to return to during moments when doubt or confusion make that same clarity harder to access in the moment, offering you, in your own past words, a reminder of exactly why this boundary matters and exactly what led you to set it in the first place. This writing doesn't need to be elaborate or polished. It simply needs to be honest, capturing the actual accumulated pattern that led to this breaking point, the specific costs you were absorbing, the specific reasons this boundary feels necessary now. Having this written record available to reread whenever old doubt or old hope threatens to destabilize your current clarity offers a stable, reliable anchor that doesn't depend on your ability to reconstruct that same clarity from memory alone during a moment when your emotional state might make that reconstruction significantly harder. This is a small, practical, and genuinely useful tool, worth taking the time to create even if it feels somewhat effortful in the moment. The investment tends to pay off significantly during the more difficult stretches of this process, offering you a stable reference point built from your own clearest thinking, ready to support you whenever that same clarity becomes harder to access in real time. Moving toward the life that's actually yours. Everything this piece has described ultimately points toward a single outcome: a life built more fully around your own needs, your own values, and your own clarity, no longer organized around anticipating or managing someone else's uncertain behavior. This life is available to you now, regardless of whatever specific pattern eventually unfolds on the other side of this particular boundary, built out of the same steady, consistent choices this piece has described throughout. This is the life worth actually building your attention around, more than any speculation about what happens next in this specific relationship. It's a life where your own peace doesn't depend on anyone else's next move, where your own worth remains stable and clear regardless of external validation, where your own healing continues steadily forward, day by day, built on a foundation of self-respect and self-trust that you've already begun constructing through everything you're navigating right now. Move toward this life deliberately, one steady choice at a time, trusting that it belongs to you fully, regardless of anything else that happens next. What happens to old patterns of anticipation over time? It's worth naming honestly that the instinct to anticipate and monitor for someone else's next move, however much this piece has encouraged you to release it, doesn't typically disappear all at once through a single decision to let it go. It tends to fade gradually, the same way most deeply ingrained patterns fade, through repeated practice of noticing the instinct and choosing, again and again, to redirect your attention elsewhere. There will likely be moments, even well into this process, when the old habit of wondering what's happening on the other side resurfaces unexpectedly, triggered by something as simple as an unrelated notification or a passing thought. When this happens, it's worth treating it gently, as an old habit rather than a sign of failed progress, redirecting your attention back to your own present life without treating the resurfacing itself as evidence that you haven't actually moved forward. Old patterns of anticipation, built up over a long relationship, take time to fully quiet down, and expecting instant, complete freedom from them sets an unrealistic standard that isn't actually necessary for genuine healing to be occurring. Over time, with consistent practice, these moments of anticipation do tend to become less frequent and less intense, eventually fading into something closer to background noise rather than the dominant preoccupation they might feel like right now. Trust this gradual fading, understanding that its pace doesn't need to match any particular timeline in order to represent genuine, meaningful progress. A final word on the word breaking. It's worth reflecting briefly on the specific word this piece's title uses, breaking point, and what that word might unintentionally imply if taken too literally. Breaking suggests something shattering, something permanently damaged, and it's worth being clear that reaching this point doesn't mean you are broken in any permanent or damaging sense. What is broken, more accurately, is a specific pattern of tolerance that had already extended well past what was actually sustainable, a pattern whose ending represents not damage to you, but the natural, healthy result of a limit finally being honored rather than continuing to be overridden. You are not broken by reaching this point. You are, if anything, more whole, more aligned with your own actual needs and limits than you were while still pushing past them in service of a pattern that wasn't serving you. This reframe matters because the language of breaking can unintentionally reinforce a sense of damage or failure that doesn't actually reflect what's happening here. What's happening is closer to a necessary release, a letting go of something unsustainable, than to any kind of genuine breaking in the sense of lasting harm. Hold this reframe alongside everything else this piece has described, understanding that the breaking point you've reached represents growth and self-respect rather than damage, regardless of how difficult and painful the process of reaching it might have genuinely been. The last word on what actually comes next. The truest answer to this piece's title in the end is that what actually comes next is determined far more by you than by anyone else. Whatever specific pattern eventually plays out externally, your own next move, the steady, consistent choice to honor the boundary you've reached, to invest in your own healing, to rebuild a life centered on your own needs rather than on anticipating or managing someone else's uncertain behavior, is the real determining factor in how this next chapter of your life actually unfolds. Trust this. Trust yourself and move forward steadily and consistently into a life built on the clarity, strength, and self-respect this breaking point has already, painfully but genuinely, given you. Recognizing when you're ready to fully let go. There will likely come a point, somewhere further along in this process than wherever you currently stand, when you notice a genuine readiness to fully let go, not just of the specific relationship this piece has been discussing, but of the ongoing project of anticipating or monitoring for any response from it at all. This readiness doesn't arrive on command, and it's not something you can force through sheer willpower before it's genuinely available to you, but it does arrive gradually, the same way every other part of this healing process arrives, through consistent practice and the accumulated passage of time. You'll know this readiness has arrived when the question of what happens next simply stops occupying significant space in your daily thoughts, when your attention has become genuinely, consistently oriented toward your own life rather than toward this uncertain external situation. This shift tends to happen gradually enough that you might not notice it in the moment, only recognizing, in retrospect, how much less this question occupies your daily awareness than it once did. When this readiness arrives, let it arrive naturally, without forcing it prematurely or judging yourself for not having reached it sooner. It comes in its own time, built out of everything described throughout this piece, and its eventual arrival is one of the clearest markers of the genuine healing you've been working toward throughout this entire process. What this experience teaches about future relationships. Beyond this specific situation, everything you're learning through this process of reaching and holding a breaking point offers valuable, transferable wisdom for every future relationship you build going forward. You're learning to recognize your own limits earlier, before they require a dramatic breaking point to finally be honored. You're learning to trust your own assessment of a situation over external speculation or doubt. You're learning that boundaries, once set, deserve to be held consistently, regardless of whatever uncertain external response they might produce. This wisdom will serve you well beyond this particular chapter, informing how you handle difficult moments in future relationships, friendships, and even professional situations where your own limits might similarly be tested. You are building, through this specific difficult experience, a broader capacity for self-respect and boundary setting that extends far beyond the specific relationship this piece has been discussing throughout. Carry this broader wisdom forward deliberately, recognizing its value beyond this immediate situation, understanding that the skills you're developing right now, however painfully, will continue to serve and protect you in every future relationship and situation that similarly tests your own limits and your own capacity for self-respect. Closing. Whatever comes next on the other side of this boundary you've set, remember that your own steady clarity, built through everything you've navigated to reach this point, remains the most reliable, most durable resource available to you throughout this entire process. It doesn't depend on correctly predicting anyone else's next move. It depends only on your continued commitment to your own needs, your own worth, and your own healing, all of which remain fully within your control regardless of anything else that happens next. Trust yourself. You have already done the hardest part. Understanding the cycle that sometimes precedes a breaking point. It can be useful for the sake of your own future self-awareness to understand the broader cycle that sometimes precedes a breaking point like the one you've reached, not to relitigate the past, but to recognize similar patterns more quickly if they ever begin to develop in a future relationship. This cycle often begins with genuine connection and genuine investment from both people, followed by a gradual increase in inconsistency from one partner, met with increasing accommodation and patience from the other. Over time, the accommodating partner absorbs more and more of the relationship's difficulty, while the inconsistent partner experiences relatively little of the natural friction that might otherwise prompt earlier change. This cycle tends to continue, sometimes for a long time, until the accommodating partner's capacity for absorption finally reaches its limit, producing the breaking point this piece has been discussing throughout. Understanding this broader cycle helps clarify that the breaking point wasn't a sudden or arbitrary event, but the natural, almost inevitable culmination of a pattern that had been building for a significant period of time, often much longer than either person may have consciously recognized while it was happening. This understanding also offers valuable protection for future relationships, helping you recognize the early stages of a similar cycle more quickly, before it has the chance to accumulate to the same degree it did this time. Recognizing early, quiet signs of this pattern, before they've had years to accumulate, is one of the most valuable, practical outcomes available to you from having lived through and fully understood this experience. The importance of not rushing toward a new relationship. It's worth offering a gentle caution about the temptation, sometimes present during this period, to rush toward a new relationship as a way of resolving the discomfort and uncertainty of this current transition. While there's nothing inherently wrong with eventually building new connections, doing so prematurely, before the healing this piece has described has had adequate time to settle, risks bringing unresolved patterns, unresolved doubt, and unprocessed grief into a new dynamic before you're actually ready to build something genuinely healthy from a place of full clarity. Give yourself permission to take the time this healing actually requires before actively pursuing significant new romantic investment, understanding that rushing this process doesn't actually speed up genuine healing, and often instead delays it further by adding new complexity before the current situation has had adequate time to fully resolve. This doesn't mean isolating yourself entirely or avoiding all social connection, but it does mean being thoughtful and intentional about the pace at which you pursue significant new romantic investment specifically. Trust that when you're genuinely ready, having fully processed and integrated everything this current experience has taught you, you'll be far better equipped to build something healthy and sustainable than you would be by rushing into something new before that integration has had adequate time to occur. Final thoughts on trusting the process. As this piece reaches its conclusion, it's worth offering one final, direct encouragement. Trust the process this piece has described throughout, even during the moments it feels slow, uncertain, or genuinely difficult. Healing from a breaking point like this one doesn't happen instantly, and it doesn't happen without some genuine difficulty along the way. But it does happen reliably for anyone willing to consistently practice the steadiness, self-trust, and self-respect this piece has described throughout. You are already, through the simple act of reaching this breaking point and beginning to hold the boundary it requires, well underway in this process. Trust that continued momentum, built through consistent, patient practice, will carry you fully through to the other side of this transition, toward a life built more fully on your own terms, regardless of anything that does or doesn't happen with the specific relationship this piece has been discussing throughout. What it means to truly let the outcome go. There's a specific, meaningful difference between intellectually understanding that you should let go of anticipating a specific outcome and actually, practically, doing so in your daily lived experience. Truly letting the outcome go means noticing repeatedly when your mind drifts toward speculation about what's happening or what will happen next, and consciously, gently, redirecting that attention back to your own present life again and again, for as long as this practice continues to be necessary. This isn't a single decision made once and then permanently completed. It's an ongoing practice, repeated daily, sometimes many times within a single day, especially in the earlier stages of this process. This practice becomes easier over time, the same way any repeated practice becomes more automatic with sufficient repetition. What feels effortful and deliberate now, catching yourself mid-speculation and redirecting your attention elsewhere, will eventually become a more natural, less effortful habit, requiring less conscious intervention each time. Trust that this ease will develop gradually, even during the earlier stages when the practice still feels effortful and sometimes exhausting to maintain consistently. Truly letting the outcome go, in this practical, ongoing sense, is one of the most valuable skills available to you from everything this piece has described, and it's a skill that will continue to serve you not just in this specific situation, but in every future situation where uncertainty about someone else's behavior might otherwise threaten to consume more of your attention and energy than is. See truly healthy or productive, a closing metaphor worth holding. It can help during this period to hold a specific image in mind, a ship that has already left a harbor, moving steadily forward into open water, no longer anchored to the specific dock it departed from. The dock in this image represents the relationship and the specific patterns this piece has described throughout. The ship represents you, and its continued forward movement represents your ongoing healing and growth, regardless of anything happening back at that particular dock. A ship that has genuinely set sail doesn't need to keep checking the dock behind it in order to keep moving forward successfully. Its forward progress depends entirely on its own navigation, its own course, its own continued movement toward wherever it's actually headed. The dock remains behind it, a fixed point in the past, increasingly distant with every mile of forward progress, regardless of whatever continues to happen at that fixed point after the ship has already departed. Hold this image whenever the pull to look backward, to monitor, to anticipate becomes strong. You are the ship, already moving forward, and your continued progress depends far more on your own steady navigation than on anything happening at the dock you've already, courageously, decided to leave behind. The end of this piece, the beginning of what's next. This piece ends here, but your own process continues, unfolding at its own pace, informed by everything described throughout these pages, but ultimately shaped by your own ongoing choices, your own continued practice, your own steady commitment to the boundary and the clarity you've already, painfully but genuinely, earned the right to hold. Whatever comes next on the other side of this specific relationship, remember that your own forward movement, your own healing, and your own worth remain fully within your control, regardless of anything else that happens. Trust yourself, trust the process, and move forward steadily into a life built on your own terms, fully and completely your own. When old hope resurfaces unexpectedly. Even well into this process, it's common for old hope to resurface unexpectedly, triggered by something as simple as a memory, a shared song, or a moment of loneliness that makes the possibility of reconciliation feel briefly more appealing than it did the day before. This resurfacing doesn't mean your healing has failed or that your breaking point wasn't valid. It simply means you're human, capable of holding complicated, sometimes contradictory feelings, even while remaining fundamentally committed to the boundary you've set. When this old hope resurfaces, it can help to acknowledge it directly rather than judging yourself for feeling it, gently reminding yourself of the accumulated reasoning that led to your breaking point in the first place, perhaps even returning to the written record this piece has already suggested creating. This isn't about suppressing the hope entirely, but about holding it in proper context, recognizing it as a natural, temporary feeling rather than as new information that should change your fundamental decision. Over time, these moments of resurfacing hope tend to become less frequent and less intense, the same way every other aspect of this healing process gradually settles with continued practice and time. Trust that this settling is happening, even during the specific moments when old hope feels surprisingly strong, understanding that its presence doesn't undo the genuine progress you've already made throughout this process. What you can offer yourself right now. As this piece moves toward its true conclusion, it's worth naming directly what you can offer yourself right now, in this present moment, regardless of anything else happening externally. You can offer yourself patience with a process that takes real time to fully unfold. You can offer yourself compassion for the difficulty of what you're navigating, without needing to minimize or rush past that difficulty in favor of a falsely cheerful narrative about strength and empowerment alone. You can offer yourself credit for the courage it took to reach this breaking point in the first place, recognizing that this courage was real and significant, regardless of anything that happens next. You can offer yourself, too, genuine hope for what comes after this specific chapter closes, hope built not on any particular outcome with this specific relationship, but on the broader, well-founded confidence that you are capable of building a genuinely good life, filled with genuine connection, regardless of how this particular situation ultimately resolves. Offer yourself all of this deliberately and repeatedly throughout the days and weeks ahead. You deserve this kindness from yourself, perhaps now more than ever, as you navigate a period that asks real courage and real patience from you, courage and patience you have already demonstrated simply by reaching the clarity this piece has been describing throughout. Final closing words. You reached this breaking point because something needed to change, and reaching it required real strength, real self-awareness, and real self-respect. Whatever happens next on the other side of the boundary you've set, remember that this strength, awareness, and respect belong to you permanently, built through everything you've already navigated, ready to carry you forward into whatever comes next, regardless of anyone else's specific response. Trust yourself. You have already done the hardest part, and everything ahead of you now is simply the continued, steady practice of honoring what you've already, courageously, decided. The freedom of defining success on your own terms. It's worth addressing directly how you define success during this period, because an unspoken, unexamined definition of success, something like them realizing what they lost and changing dramatically as a result, sets you up for continued disappointment regardless of how well you're actually doing in terms of your own healing and growth. Redefining success on your own terms means measuring progress by your own steadiness, your own returning sense of peace, your own rebuilding life, rather than by any specific external outcome involving the other person's behavior or realization. This redefinition is genuinely freeing because it means success becomes something entirely within your control, achievable regardless of whatever happens externally. You succeed by this redefined standard every time you choose your own well-being over anxious speculation, every time you invest in your own life rather than waiting for an external signal before allowing yourself to move forward, every time you hold your boundary consistently despite uncertainty or doubt. This is success worth measuring yourself against, far more achievable and far more meaningful than success defined by someone else's uncertain, unpredictable behavior. Adopt this redefined standard deliberately, checking in with yourself periodically about how you're doing according to this more accurate, more achievable measure, rather than continuing to measure your progress against an external outcome that was never actually within your control to determine in the first place. What this piece has really been offering. At its core, this piece has been offering a single, central reframe. The real story here was never actually about correctly predicting someone else's next move. It has always been about your own next move, your own choices, your own continued commitment to the clarity and boundary you've already, painfully, earned the right to hold. Everything else, every pattern this piece has described, every possibility it has addressed, has ultimately pointed back toward this same central truth. Your own steadiness, built independently of external circumstances, is the real determining factor in how this next chapter of your life unfolds. Carry this reframe forward as the true takeaway from everything offered throughout this piece. Whatever specific pattern eventually plays out, your own healing, your own growth, and your own life remain fully within your control, ready to be built deliberately, day by day, regardless of anything else that happens. Closing. This is where the piece ends and where your own continued process begins, unfolding at its own pace, informed by everything described here but ultimately shaped by your own steady, consistent choices going forward. Trust yourself, trust the clarity you've already reached, and move forward fully and completely into a life built on your own terms, whole and entirely your own. A note on anger and where it fits. It's worth addressing directly a feeling that sometimes accompanies a breaking point, but that this piece hasn't yet fully named. Anger, specifically anger at having reached this point at all, anger at the accumulated pattern that made it necessary, anger that might surface alongside the grief and clarity this piece has already described. Anger is a legitimate, appropriate response to having your patience and goodwill absorbed for far longer than was actually sustainable, and it deserves space alongside everything else you're processing right now, rather than being suppressed in favor of a more composed, purely strength-focused narrative. Anger held and processed rather than suppressed can actually support the steadiness this piece has described throughout, offering fuel and clarity for holding your boundary firmly rather than second-guessing it. The key is finding healthy ways to process this anger through movement, through honest conversation with trusted people, through writing, rather than letting it either consume you entirely or get suppressed so thoroughly that it resurfaces later in less constructive ways. Give yourself permission to feel this anger fully, alongside the grief, the clarity, and the strength this piece has already described. All of these feelings can coexist, informing and supporting each other rather than needing to be resolved into a single, simpler emotional state before you're allowed to move forward with the healing this piece has outlined throughout. The practice of returning to yourself. If there's a single practice worth committing to above all others described throughout this piece, it's the practice of returning again and again to yourself, to your own needs, your own values, your own clarity, whenever anything external threatens to pull your attention away from this central anchor. This practice doesn't require perfection. It simply requires the willingness to notice when your attention has drifted outward, toward speculation or anticipation, and to gently, repeatedly, bring it back home to yourself. This is the real skill underneath everything this piece has described, more valuable than any specific insight about patterns or predictions, because it's the skill that will actually carry you through whatever specific outcome eventually unfolds. Practice it deliberately, patiently, and repeatedly, trusting that each return to yourself, however small, contributes to the larger, more durable steadiness this entire piece has been working to help you build. Final words. You have already done the hardest part. You reached your breaking point, and you're honoring it. Whatever comes next on the other side of this boundary, your own steady return to yourself, practiced consistently and patiently, will carry you through, fully and completely, into a life built entirely on your own terms. What self-compassion looks like day to day. It's worth translating the concept of self-compassion, referenced throughout this piece, into something more concrete and actionable for the specific days ahead. Self-compassion in practice might look like speaking to yourself the way you'd speak to a close friend going through the exact same situation, offering the same patience, the same understanding, the same lack of harsh judgment you'd naturally extend to someone else in your position. It might look like allowing yourself an unproductive day without treating that day as evidence of failure, understanding that healing isn't a linear, constantly upward process, but one that naturally includes both progress and temporary setbacks. It might look like celebrating small wins, a day where you didn't check for external signals as often as the day before, a moment where old doubt arose and you were able to redirect it more quickly than you might have a week earlier, a conversation where you spoke about this experience with more clarity and less anguish than you could have managed initially. These small wins matter, and noticing them deliberately, rather than only noticing the moments of continued struggle, offers a more balanced, more accurate, and ultimately more sustaining view of your own actual progress. Practice this day-to-day self-compassion deliberately, understanding that it's not indulgence or weakness, but an essential, practical component of the healing this entire piece has been describing throughout, one that makes the harder parts of this process more bearable and the eventual outcome more genuinely sustainable. The quiet confidence ahead. Somewhere ahead of you, built out of everything described throughout this piece, is a quiet confidence, not loud or performative but steady and genuine, reflecting your own trust in your ability to recognize and honor your own limits, your own worth, and your own needs, regardless of external circumstances. This confidence is already forming, built through every choice you're making right now to hold your boundary, invest in your own healing, and resist the pull of anxious speculation about someone else's uncertain next move. Trust that this confidence continues to grow, gradually and steadily, with each day you continue practicing everything this piece has described. It doesn't require any specific external outcome to fully develop. It requires only your continued commitment to the process, your continued patience with yourself, and your continued willingness to choose your own well-being again and again, regardless of whatever remains uncertain externally. Closing. This piece closes here, having offered everything it can offer, understanding, patterns worth recognizing without over-relying on them, and above all, a consistent redirection back toward the only thing that actually determines your own peace, your own steady, continued commitment to yourself. Whatever happens next, you are equipped for it, carrying forward the strength, clarity, and self-respect this breaking point has already, difficult as it was to reach, given you permanently. A reflection on what you owe yourself now. Having reached this breaking point and begun the process of holding a boundary around it, it's worth considering directly what you owe yourself now, in the aftermath of everything that led here. You owe yourself patience with a healing process that takes real time. You owe yourself credit for the courage this decision required, even on days when it doesn't feel courageous, when it simply feels difficult and uncertain. You owe yourself the same generosity of understanding you would extend to any friend navigating a similarly difficult transition, rather than holding yourself to a harsher, less forgiving standard simply because you're the one living through it directly. You also owe yourself genuine investment in your own life going forward, not as a distraction from this difficult period, but as the actual substance of your healing, the redirection of energy that used to go toward managing this relationship into pursuits, connections, and goals that belong entirely to you. This investment is not optional or secondary to the emotional processing this piece has described throughout. It's an equally important part of the same overall healing, deserving genuine time and attention rather than being treated as something to attend to only once the emotional work feels complete. Give yourself all of this, deliberately and consistently, throughout the days and weeks ahead. You deserve it not because of anything you've proven or achieved, but simply because you are worthy of the same patience, compassion, and investment you would readily offer anyone else navigating a difficult chapter like the one you're moving through right now. The truest ending available. The truest ending available to this piece is not a specific prediction about what happens next in this particular relationship, because that prediction was never actually available to offer with any real confidence. The truest ending is this: you have reached a point of genuine clarity earned through real difficulty, and that clarity, held steadily and consistently, will carry you forward into whatever comes next, regardless of any specific external event. This is the real conclusion this piece has been building toward throughout, more valuable and more reliable than any speculation about someone else's uncertain future behavior. Trust this clarity, trust yourself, and move forward fully and completely into a life shaped by your own steady hand, whole and entirely your own, regardless of anything else that happens from here. What this means for the relationships you build next. Everything described throughout this piece will shape, in valuable ways, whoever comes into your life next, whether as a friend, a partner, or any other significant connection. You'll bring a sharper instinct for recognizing early signs of an unsustainable pattern, rather than waiting, as you may have this time, until exhaustion has fully set in before addressing it. You'll bring a clearer sense of what genuine, sustained change actually requires, rather than being persuaded prematurely by a single compelling gesture or moment of renewed effort. You'll bring, too, a deeper trust in your own perception and your own limits, built through the direct, difficult experience of having lived through exactly what this piece has described throughout. This wisdom, hard-won and specific, will make every future relationship healthier and more sustainable, not because you'll become guarded or distrustful, but because you'll bring genuine discernment alongside genuine openness, protecting yourself from repeating a pattern you now understand clearly enough to recognize much earlier than before. Whoever comes next will be meeting a version of you shaped by this experience, not damaged by it, equipped with real wisdom about your own limits and your own worth, ready to build something healthier and more sustainable than what came before. Closing thought. You reached a breaking point because something had to change, and you found within yourself the strength to finally honor that need rather than continuing to override it indefinitely. This strength belongs to you now permanently, ready to carry you forward through whatever comes next, regardless of any specific pattern that unfolds on the other side of the boundary you've courageously set. Trust yourself. You are already, in every way that matters, moving forward. The difference between reacting and responding. It's worth drawing a clear, practical distinction between reacting and responding, because this distinction will serve you well not just during this specific period, but in every future situation that tests your patience and your boundaries. Reacting tends to be immediate, driven by whatever emotion is most intense in a given moment, often leading to choices you might not fully endorse once that intensity has settled. Responding, by contrast, involves a brief pause, even just a few moments, before choosing how to act, allowing your more considered values and clarity to guide the choice rather than the immediate emotional intensity of the moment alone. Building this pause into your own behavior, especially during a period when you might be presented with unexpected external developments, whether increased contact, silence, or something else entirely, protects you from reactive choices you might later regret, giving your own considered clarity the chance to actually inform your behavior rather than being overridden by momentary emotional intensity. Why this doesn't mean suppressing your emotions or pretending they don't matter. It means giving yourself enough space to feel them fully while still allowing your more considered judgment to guide your actual choices and actions. Practice this distinction deliberately during the days ahead, building in a small pause whenever significant emotional intensity arises, before deciding how to actually respond to whatever has triggered that intensity. This small practice offers real protection, ensuring that your actions continue to reflect your own considered values rather than being hijacked by momentary emotional reactivity, however understandable that reactivity might be in the moment. A closing blessing for the road ahead. May you move through whatever comes next with steadiness, patience, and genuine self-compassion. May the clarity you've reached continue to deepen and settle, becoming more solid and more automatic with each day that passes. May you find, in your own company and in the support of those who genuinely care for you, everything you need to navigate this transition fully and completely. And may you arrive in your own time at a place of genuine peace, built not on anyone else's next move, but on your own steady, continued commitment to your own worth, your own healing, and your own life, fully and entirely your own. This is where this piece truly ends, offering you not a prediction, but a foundation, one built entirely out of your own strength, your own clarity, and your own capacity to move forward, regardless of anything else that happens next. What to remember on the hardest days. There will likely be specific days harder than the rest when everything this piece has described feels distant, difficult to access, overshadowed by acute grief, loneliness, or doubt. On these hardest days, it's worth having a few simple, clear things to return to, things that don't require extensive reasoning to access even when your capacity for extensive reasoning feels temporarily diminished. Remember that this breaking point was earned, built out of real accumulated evidence, not an overreaction to be second-guessed. Remember that your worth doesn't depend on this specific relationship's outcome. Remember that healing isn't linear, and a hard day doesn't undo the genuine progress you've already made. Remember, too, that these hardest days do pass, even when they feel in the moment as though they might not. This is not empty reassurance. It reflects the genuine, well-documented pattern of how healing from significant loss and difficulty actually unfolds, through waves of intensity that do, reliably, soften and become less frequent with time and continued care for yourself. On these hardest days, lean more heavily on your support system, on whatever practices help you feel more grounded, and on simple, basic self-care, understanding that surviving the hardest days is itself a significant, meaningful accomplishment, deserving of real credit even when it doesn't feel like much in the moment. The real gift this experience has given you. Beyond everything specific this piece has described about the relationship itself, the real, lasting gift available from this entire experience is a deeper, more durable relationship with your own judgment, your own limits, and your own worth. You now know from direct experience that you're capable of recognizing an unsustainable pattern and acting on that recognition, even when doing so is difficult, even when the outcome remains genuinely uncertain. This knowledge becomes a permanent resource, carried forward into every future situation that similarly tests your patience, your boundaries, and your sense of your own worth. This gift, hard-won through real difficulty, is worth recognizing and honoring directly, separate from whatever specific outcome eventually unfolds with this particular relationship. You are, in a real and lasting sense, stronger and wiser for having lived through this experience, equipped now with tools and self-knowledge that will serve you reliably for the rest of your life, regardless of anything else that happens next. Final closing. You have reached your breaking point and you are honoring it. This is enough. Whatever comes next, you are equipped, strengthened, and fully capable of moving forward into a life built entirely on your own terms, whole and completely your own. The value of ritual in marking this transition. It can be genuinely helpful during a significant transition like this one to mark it with some form of deliberate ritual, however simple, that honors the significance of what you're moving through. This might mean writing a letter you don't send, articulating everything you need to say without the pressure of an actual response. It might mean a small, private ceremony of releasing physical items connected to the relationship, not as an act of erasure, but as a deliberate, symbolic marking of this transition. It might mean simply setting aside dedicated time, away from ordinary distractions, to fully acknowledge and honor what you're moving through. These rituals don't need to be elaborate or follow any particular formula. Their value lies in the deliberate attention and acknowledgement they offer, helping mark this transition as significant rather than letting it blend anonymously into the ordinary flow of daily life without any specific recognition of its importance. Consider what kind of ritual might feel meaningful and appropriate for you specifically, adapting the general concept to whatever resonates most with your own particular way of processing significant experiences. Whatever form this ritual takes, if you choose to engage in one at all, let it serve the purpose this entire piece has been describing throughout, honoring the difficulty and significance of what you're navigating, while also marking your own intentional, deliberate movement forward into whatever comes next. A reminder about your own resilience. It's worth closing with a direct reminder of something this piece has touched on throughout, but that deserves explicit, final emphasis. You are more resilient than you might currently believe yourself to be, especially during the harder moments of this specific transition. You have already survived difficult things before this relationship, and you will survive this too, carrying forward from it real wisdom, real strength, and a deeper trust in your own capacity to navigate whatever life presents going forward. This resilience isn't something you need to manufacture or prove. It's already present within you, demonstrated through everything you've already survived up to this point, including the difficult work of reaching and honoring this breaking point in the first place. Trust this resilience, especially on the days it feels hardest to access, understanding that its presence doesn't depend on how strong you happen to feel in any particular moment. The final word. You have reached your breaking point, and in doing so, you have already demonstrated exactly the strength and self-respect this entire piece has been describing throughout. Whatever comes next, you carry this strength forward with you, permanently, ready to support you through this transition and through everything that follows it, for the rest of a life that remains entirely and completely your own. What to do with renewed contact, practically speaking. If renewed contact does eventually arrive, whether soon or much later, it's worth having a practical, considered approach ready in advance, rather than needing to construct one reactively in the moment. This might mean giving yourself deliberate space before responding, rather than replying immediately out of habit or anxiety. It might mean evaluating any message not just for its immediate content, but for how well it aligns with the standard you've already established for what genuine, sustained change would actually require. It might mean consulting before responding with a trusted friend who can offer a perspective less clouded by the immediate emotional intensity such contact might understandably produce. Having this practical approach ready in advance protects you from being caught off guard, ensuring that whatever response you eventually offer, if you choose to offer one at all, reflects your own considered judgment rather than an immediate, potentially reactive impulse. This preparation is one of the most concrete, actionable steps available to you from everything this piece has described, translating the broader concepts into an actual practical plan you can rely on if and when this specific situation arises. Whatever you decide in the moment, trust that you're allowed to take whatever time you need before responding, that you're not obligated to reply immediately or at all, and that your own careful, considered judgment deserves far more weight than any pressure, real or imagined, to respond quickly. The closing truth. This piece closes with the same truth it opened with. You are never actually going to find real peace by correctly predicting someone else's next move. Real peace comes from the steady, consistent practice of honoring your own clarity, your own worth, and your own healing, regardless of anything external. You have already begun this practice simply by reaching this breaking point, and every day you continue it, you build further evidence of your own strength and your own capacity to navigate this transition fully and completely. Trust yourself, trust the process. And walk forward steadily and with genuine self-respect into whatever comes next, carrying with you everything this experience has already, difficult as it was, given you. The people who will understand. As you move through this process, you'll likely find that some people understand it more readily than others, and it's worth seeking out, deliberately, the people in your life who do offer this genuine understanding, rather than spending disproportionate energy trying to help people who struggle to grasp the significance of what you're navigating fully appreciate it. Not everyone will understand why this specific breaking point matters as much as it does, especially people who haven't lived through something similar themselves, and that's all right. Their lack of full understanding doesn't invalidate your own experience or your own decision. Seek out instead the people who do understand, whether through their own similar experiences or simply through their capacity for genuine empathy and careful listening. These are the people worth leaning on most heavily during this period, offering the kind of validation and steady support that helps reinforce your own clarity rather than inadvertently undermining it through well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful skepticism or minimization. If you don't currently have people like this readily available in your life, consider whether professional support, through therapy or counseling, might offer some of this same understanding and validation, a resource specifically equipped to help you navigate exactly this kind of significant transition with genuine expertise and care. Closing reflection. You have navigated something genuinely difficult in reaching this breaking point, and you continue to navigate something difficult in holding the boundary it requires. This difficulty is real, and it deserves acknowledgement, alongside the genuine strength, clarity, and self-respect this entire process has already given you. Whatever comes next, you carry all of this forward with you, ready for whatever this next chapter of your life actually holds. What remains true no matter what. As this piece truly nears its conclusion, it's worth restating clearly what remains true regardless of any specific detail about what happens next, because these truths are the actual foundation this entire piece has been trying to help you build. Your worth remains constant, unaffected by this relationship's outcome or by anyone else's specific response to the boundary you've set. Your breaking point was valid, earned through real accumulated experience, not something requiring anyone else's confirmation or validation to be legitimate. Your healing remains fully within your own control, unfolding according to your own continued choices and your own consistent practice, regardless of external circumstances. These truths don't depend on any specific prediction about someone else's behavior. They remain solid and reliable regardless of whatever pattern eventually unfolds, offering you a stable foundation to return to whenever uncertainty, doubt, or difficulty make that foundation harder to feel in the moment. Hold these truths close, returning to them repeatedly throughout this process, trusting that their stability will continue to support you through whatever comes next, exactly as it has already supported you through everything you've navigated to reach this point. The last word. You have reached your breaking point, you are honoring it. And whatever comes next, you are already, through this simple but significant act, moving steadily toward a life built on your own genuine strength, your own hard-won clarity, and your own complete, unwavering worth. One more thought on patience with uncertainty. Uncertainty by its nature is uncomfortable, and it's worth acknowledging directly that no amount of reframing or understanding fully removes that discomfort, only makes it more bearable and more manageable while you move through it. You don't need to achieve a state of complete comfort with uncertainty in order to be healing well. You simply need to develop enough tolerance for it that it doesn't prevent you from continuing to invest in your own life and your own forward movement, even while that uncertainty remains genuinely present. This tolerance builds gradually, the same way every other skill described throughout this piece builds, through repeated practice and repeated exposure to the discomfort itself, without that discomfort needing to fully resolve before you're able to function well despite it. Trust that this tolerance is developing, even during the moments the underlying uncertainty still feels genuinely uncomfortable, understanding that discomfort tolerated is still meaningful progress, even when it hasn't yet been fully resolved into comfort or certainty. Closing. This piece offers its final word here. You are capable, resilient, and already, through everything you've navigated to reach this point, demonstrating exactly the strength this transition requires. Trust yourself, hold your boundary, and move forward steadily and completely into a life that belongs fully and entirely to you. A final practical checklist. As a closing, practical summary of everything this piece has described, it may help to have a brief, concrete checklist to return to during moments when the broader concepts feel harder to access. Ground yourself in your own written reasoning for this breaking point whenever doubt arises. Redirect your attention gently, repeatedly, away from speculation about someone else's next move and back toward your own present life. Invest deliberately in your own support system, your own routines, and your own healing process, treating these investments as the real substance of this transition rather than secondary to it. Give yourself permission to feel the full range of emotions this process involves: grief, anger, relief, uncertainty, without judging any of them as wrong or as evidence of failed progress. And trust consistently that your own steady commitment to yourself is the actual determining factor in how this next chapter of your life unfolds, regardless of anything else that happens externally. Return to this checklist whenever you need a concrete, practical anchor, understanding that it distills everything this piece has offered into something immediately actionable, ready to support you through whatever the days and weeks ahead actually bring. Truly final words. You have already done the hardest part. Whatever comes next, you are equipped and you are ready. What this breaking point ultimately represents. Stepping back from all the specific detail this piece has offered, it's worth naming plainly what this breaking point ultimately represents in the broader arc of your life. Not an ending defined by loss, but a turning point defined by growth, self-respect, and the reclamation of your own attention and energy from a pattern that had stopped serving you. This reframe matters because the language of breaking points can sometimes overemphasize the loss involved, while underemphasizing the genuine forward movement this moment actually represents. You are right now at a genuine turning point, one that will likely look, in retrospect, like one of the more significant moments of growth and self-respect in your broader life story, regardless of the specific external details that eventually unfold. This isn't a minimization of the real difficulty involved. It's an accurate recognition of what this moment actually means. Alongside that difficulty, both truths existing simultaneously without one canceling out the other. Hold this broader perspective alongside everything else this piece has described, understanding that even the hardest parts of this process are contributing to a larger story of growth, one that will likely become clearer and more visible the further you move forward from this specific moment. The version of you on the other side. Somewhere ahead of you, built out of everything this piece has described, is a version of you who has fully integrated this experience, who looks back on this breaking point not with lingering pain, but with genuine gratitude for her own strength in reaching and honoring it. This version of you doesn't need to guess what happens next because she's already, by that point, fully invested in a life that doesn't depend on the answer to that question. She carries forward the wisdom this experience has taught her, without carrying forward the acute pain that characterized its earlier stages. This version of you is not a distant fantasy. She's already forming, built gradually through everything you're navigating right now, growing steadier and more fully realized with each day you continue practicing the steadiness, self-trust, and self-respect this piece has described throughout. Trust her, trust the process that's building her, and know that she is, even now, closer than she might currently feel. The end. This piece closes here, having offered everything it can meaningfully offer. What comes next is yours to build, one steady day at a time, carrying forward the strength, clarity, and self-respect this breaking point has already, difficult as it was to reach, given you permanently and completely. A word on reading this piece more than once. If this piece resonates with you now, it's worth considering returning to it again at different points throughout this process, because different sections may prove more or less relevant depending on where you happen to stand at any given moment. Early on, the sections addressing the immediate breaking point and the general patterns worth understanding might feel most relevant. Later, as time passes, the sections addressing sustained healing, future relationships, and the quieter, ongoing practice of returning to yourself might offer more useful guidance. There's no need to absorb everything this piece offers in a single reading. Let it serve as an ongoing resource, something to return to as needed, rather than something you need to fully internalize immediately in order for it to be useful. Healing happens gradually, and different pieces of guidance tend to land more meaningfully at different stages of that gradual process. Gratitude for your own courage. Before this piece truly ends, it's worth pausing one final time to acknowledge, directly and without qualification, the courage it took to reach this breaking point in the first place. Courage doesn't always look dramatic. Often, as this piece has described throughout, it looks quiet, internal, almost invisible from the outside, simply the accumulated willingness to finally, after everything, choose yourself. This courage deserves genuine recognition, not just from the people around you, but from yourself, directly and without minimization. You found this courage. You're using it right now in the ongoing, difficult work of holding this boundary despite uncertainty. Recognize this fully, and let that recognition offer you some of the same strength and support this entire piece has been trying to provide throughout. Closing. You have reached your breaking point, and you are meeting it with real courage, real clarity, and real self-respect. Whatever comes next, this piece leaves you with a single, final truth. You are already, through everything you've navigated to reach this moment, exactly as strong as you need to be for whatever comes ahead. A final reflection on what endures. Relationships end, sometimes suddenly and sometimes gradually, sometimes clearly and sometimes ambiguously, and the specific details of how any particular relationship concludes tend to matter less over time than what actually endures afterward. Your own character, your own growth, your own continued capacity for love and connection, undiminished by whatever difficulty you've just moved through. This is what actually persists, long after the specific details of this particular chapter have faded into the broader, ongoing story of your life. Trust that what endures in you, your capacity for genuine love, your growing wisdom about your own limits and worth, your resilience through real difficulty, matters far more than any specific outcome this piece has speculated about throughout. This enduring core of who you are is what will actually carry you forward, not just through this transition, but through everything life continues to present in the years ahead. The simplest truth. If everything else in this piece feels like too much to hold on to, let this simplest truth remain. You reached your limit and you're honoring it. That's enough. That's genuinely, completely enough, and everything else will unfold from there, in its own time, at its own pace, carried forward by the same strength and clarity that got you to this exact moment. Closing. Thank you for trusting this process, and trusting yourself enough to reach this breaking point in the first place. Whatever comes next, you are ready, equipped, and already in every way that matters, moving forward. The freedom of an unwritten future. It's worth closing with a reflection on the freedom actually available in not knowing exactly what comes next. A freedom easy to overlook when uncertainty feels primarily like a source of anxiety rather than possibility. An unwritten future means nothing has yet been foreclosed, means the specific shape of your life going forward remains genuinely open, shaped by choices you haven't yet made rather than locked into a single predetermined outcome. This openness, while uncomfortable in its uncertainty, also holds real possibility, room for growth and connection and joy that hasn't yet been specifically defined or limited. Rather than experiencing this unwritten quality only as a source of anxious uncertainty, it's worth also holding it, when you can, as a source of genuine possibility, a reminder that the story ahead of you remains yours to write, informed by everything you've learned through this experience but not confined by any single predetermined outcome. This shift in framing doesn't erase the discomfort of uncertainty, but it does offer a more balanced, more hopeful way of holding it alongside whatever difficulty remains present during this transition. Final words, truly. You stand now at the beginning of an unwritten chapter, informed by real difficulty and real growth, equipped with genuine wisdom and genuine strength, ready to write whatever comes next according to your own values and your own worth. This is where this piece leaves you, not with a prediction but with an invitation to build forward deliberately and with self-respect into a life that remains entirely and completely yours to shape. A note for the days you feel like giving up on this clarity. There will likely be at least one day, maybe several, when everything this piece has described feels genuinely hard to access, when the pull to abandon this boundary entirely feels stronger than the resolve to hold it. On these specific days, it's worth having a simple, minimal commitment ready, something smaller than the full weight of everything this piece has described. Simply not reaching out today, simply getting through these next 24 hours, simply postponing any significant decision until tomorrow, when clearer thinking might be more accessible again. This kind of minimal, day-by-day commitment can carry you through the hardest stretches more effectively than trying to hold the entire, larger picture in mind during moments when that larger picture feels genuinely out of reach. Give yourself permission to shrink the time frame when necessary, focusing only on getting through the next day or even the next hour, rather than requiring yourself to maintain full clarity about the entire process at every single moment. This is not a failure of the broader understanding this piece has offered. It's simply a practical, realistic acknowledgement that healing sometimes requires meeting yourself exactly where you are, even when where you are is smaller and more limited than where you'd like to be. The very last word. You are doing this, one day, one choice, one moment of returning to yourself at a time. That is enough, and it will continue to be enough, all the way through to the other side of this transition, into a life built entirely and completely on your own terms. What you'll tell someone else in this position someday. There may come a time further down the road when someone close to you finds themselves navigating a breaking point similar to the one you're moving through right now, and it's worth imagining, briefly, what you might tell them from the vantage point of having already lived through and healed from this exact experience. You'll likely tell them that the anticipation is often harder than whatever actually follows. You'll likely tell them that their own steadiness matters far more than correctly predicting anyone else's next move. You'll likely tell them that healing takes real time, that setbacks don't undo genuine progress, and that they are far more capable of navigating this than they currently believe themselves to be. Imagining this future conversation can offer a useful, grounding perspective right now, reminding you that the wisdom you'll eventually offer someone else is wisdom you're actively building, right now, through everything you're currently navigating. You are, in a very real sense, becoming the person who will someday offer exactly this kind of steady, hard-won guidance to someone else standing where you're standing today. Closing. This is where the piece truly, finally ends. You have everything you need already, your own clarity, your own strength, and your own capacity to build forward, one steady day at a time, into a life that belongs completely and permanently to you. A brief word on celebrating this milestone. It's worth naming directly that reaching and honoring a breaking point like this one is genuinely worth marking as a milestone, not just a difficult ending, but an actual achievement in your own personal growth, deserving of some form of genuine acknowledgement or celebration, however small or private that acknowledgement might be. This might mean treating yourself to something meaningful, spending time with people who support and celebrate your own strength, or simply taking a quiet moment to privately honor how far you've already come in reaching this point. Celebrating this milestone doesn't minimize the real difficulty involved in reaching it. It simply recognizes that difficulty and achievement can coexist, that something can be genuinely hard and also genuinely worth honoring as real, meaningful progress. Give yourself this acknowledgement, understanding that you've earned it through everything you've already navigated to arrive at this specific point in your own story. The final closing. You have reached your breaking point. You are honoring it with real courage and real self-respect, and whatever comes next, you carry forward everything this experience has already given you. Strength, clarity, wisdom, and a life that remains, now and always, entirely and completely your own. One last practical thought on time. It's worth closing with a practical note about time itself, since so much of this piece has referenced the gradual, ongoing nature of the healing it describes. Time alone doesn't heal anything automatically, but time combined with deliberate, consistent care for yourself, the practices this piece has described throughout, does produce genuine, measurable healing, reliably, for nearly everyone who commits to that combination consistently. Trust that the days ahead, however difficult some of them prove to be, are actively contributing to this gradual healing. Even during the specific days it doesn't feel that way at all. Give this process the actual time it requires, resisting any pressure, internal or external, to rush toward a resolution before you're genuinely ready for it. The pace of your own healing is valid exactly as it unfolds, and trusting that pace rather than fighting against it is itself part of the healing this entire piece has been describing throughout, the truest closing. You are exactly where you need to be in this process, doing exactly the work this moment requires of you. Trust yourself, trust the time this healing needs, and walk forward, steadily and with genuine self-respect, into a life that is completely and entirely your own. A genuine closing. There is nothing left to predict, nothing left to anticipate, nothing left that requires you to correctly guess what happens next in order to move forward with genuine confidence. You have already built everything you actually need: clarity about your own limits, respect for your own worth, and the steady, ongoing commitment to honor both, regardless of anything external. This is the real foundation this entire piece has been trying to help you build, and it is, at this point, genuinely and completely yours. Carry it forward into whatever comes next, trusting that it will hold, because it was built not on speculation about someone else, but on the solid, dependable ground of your own hard-won self-respect. Last reflection. Whatever their next move turns out to be, or doesn't turn out to be, your own next move remains the same, steady and consistent. Continuing to choose yourself, continuing to invest in your own healing, continuing to build a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's uncertain behavior for its stability or its worth. This is the move that actually matters, the one entirely within your control, and it's the move you are already, right now, in the process of making. Closing line. You reached your breaking point, you are honoring it. And that, more than any prediction this piece could ever offer, is what will carry you fully and completely into whatever comes next. Final note. May you walk forward from here with steadiness, patience, and a full, unwavering trust in your own worth, regardless of anything else that ever happens next. This is enough, it was always going to be enough, and it is yours now and always. You are whole, you are ready, and whatever comes next, you will meet it exactly as you are, strong, clear, and completely your own. This is where the story of this chapter closes, and where the story of everything ahead of you, entirely unwritten and entirely yours, truly begins. Go forward now steadily and build it well. You are more than ready for what comes next, and you always have been. Closing. Whatever their next move turns out to be, it was never going to be the thing that determined your peace. Your peace was always going to come from here, from the moment you finally trusted yourself enough to say this is my limit and meant it. You've already said it, you're already living inside it. That is the real ending to the story, and it belongs completely and permanently to you. You are ready for whatever comes next, and you always were. Go now and live it fully. This is enough. It was always going to be enough. You are whole, you are steady, and you are already moving forward. Carry it well, you are ready.